Hey guys, tonight the journey leads through the scarred wooden door of a medieval tavern into the dim interior where ale flows, coins change hands, and humanity in all its messy glory gathers to drink, eat, argue, flirt, gamble, and occasionally fight. Following a tavern worker through a single day reveals not just the mechanics of medieval hospitality, but the texture of ordinary life, the social world of the common people, the economics of survival, and the daily navigation of a workplace that was simultaneously community centre, business establishment, and potential powder keg of violence and vice. Before settling in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if there's genuine interest in what unfolds here, and let everyone know in the comments where the viewing is happening from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see who's joining from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and ease into tonight's journey together. When modern minds imagine medieval taverns, certain images tend to surface. Roaring fires and wooden tables, frothing tankards and hearty laughter, wenches dodging grabbing hands while bringing food and drink, perhaps a minstrel in the corner, and a fight breaking out over dice. These visions carry some truth, certainly, but they represent only the most dramatic and romanticised moments of establishments whose daily reality was far more complex, tedious, and often unpleasant than popular imagination suggests. The tavern was a fundamental institution in medieval life, serving multiple essential functions. It provided food and drink to travellers who couldn't carry sufficient provisions. It offered lodging to those away from home. It served as a social gathering place for locals lacking space in cramped homes. It functioned as informal exchange where news, gossip and business were transacted. It provided entertainment through gaming, music, and the company of others. And it generated revenue for operators while employing workers in various capacities. Understanding tavern work reveals several important dimensions of medieval life. It shows the labour conditions of service workers in an era before labour regulations or workplace protections. It demonstrates the social mixing that occurred as people from various classes and backgrounds shared space. It reveals gender dynamics in a workplace where women often worked despite restrictions on female public presence. And it illuminates the economic precariousness of people trying to make livings in establishments with thin profit margins and uncertain clientele. The sources for understanding medieval tavern life are scattered and often problematic. Legal records mention taverns when crimes occurred or regulations were violated. Literary sources include tavern scenes, but typically for plot purposes rather than accurate workplace description. Account books from some establishments survive, showing expenses and revenues without capturing daily experience. Moral literature condemns taverns as dens of vice, providing negative characterizations rather than balanced portraits. Archaeological evidence reveals physical structures and material culture without documenting the human interactions that fill those spaces. The term tavern itself covers considerable diversity. The establishments range from barely respectable alehouses in villages to substantial urban inns hosting wealthy travellers. Some were family operations run from homes where ale was brewed. Others were larger commercial establishments employing multiple workers. The legal status and regulation varied by region and era. The experience of working in different types of establishments diverged significantly. Tonight's exploration follows a composite tavern worker through a single day in a mid-sized urban tavern in late medieval England around 1400. The worker is Marjorie, a young woman in her early 20s, unmarried, working for wages in an establishment owned by John the Taverner. While this specific person and place are fictional, the details draw from historical evidence about real taverns, real workers, and real daily experiences documented in various sources. The goal is not creating fantasy, but rather reconstructing plausible reality. The day begins before dawn and extends past midnight, encompassing the full cycle of opening, operating and closing the establishment. The exploration examines not just the work tasks, but also the social interactions, dangers, pleasures, frustrations and human experiences that filled Marjorie's long working day. The journey reveals that tavern work combined genuine camaraderie and satisfaction with grinding labour, low pay, social stigma, and constant vulnerability to abuse, violence and exploitation. So settle in, perhaps with appreciation for modern service industry regulations and minimum wages, and prepare to spend a day in a medieval tavern. The reality involves more hard physical labour, more danger, more tedium, and more human complexity than the romantic vision suggests, while also containing the genuine social warmth, entertainment, and community that made taverns beloved institutions despite their notorious reputations. The day begins before the sun rises, in the cold and dark hours when most of the city still sleeps. Marjorie wakes in the small room she shares with the other female servant, Agnes, in the attic above the tavern. The space is cramped, with 2 straw mattresses on the floor, a small chest containing their few possessions, and little else. The cold penetrates the thin walls, making rising from beneath the single blanket they share a test of will. The room smells of stale sweat, smoke, and the general mustiness of inadequate ventilation. The smells from the tavern below, spilled ale, hearth smoke, and yesterday's food, permeate everything. Marjorie has lived with these smells for the 3 years she's worked here, and they've become so familiar she barely notices them consciously, though they cling to her clothes and hair and skin, marking her as a tavern worker to anyone she encounters outside. Agnes is already stirring, muttering complaints about the cold and the early hour as she pulls on her shift and outer clothing. Both women dress in the dim light filtering through cracks in the roof boards, their breath visible in the cold air. The clothing is practical and worn. Linen shifts under wool gowns, worn leather shoes, head coverings to keep hair relatively clean. Nothing marks them as particularly respectable or wealthy. Their appearance immediately identifies them as working women of the lower sort. The descent from the attic requires navigating a narrow ladder in near darkness, a hazardous journey made dozens of times but never entirely safe. The tavern's main room is dark and cold, with only embers remaining in the hearth from the previous night's fire. The space is perhaps 30 feet by 20, with a low ceiling supported by dark beams. Long wooden tables with benches fill most of the floor space. A barrel serving as makeshift bar sits along one wall. The floor is packed earth covered with rushes that need changing, but probably won't be for a few more days. The first task is rekindling the fire, essential for everything that follows. Marjorie kneels before the hearth, arranging kindling over the embers, blowing gently to coax flames back to life. Her hands are cold and her knees ache from the damp floor, but the fire starting is crucial work that can't be delegated or delayed. The kindling catches, small flames growing as she adds larger pieces of wood. The smoke makes her cough until the chimney begins drawing properly. As the fire grows, Agnes begins sweeping, pushing the previous day's detritus, food scraps, spilled ale, tracked-in mud, and various unidentifiable debris, toward the door to be thrown into the street. The rushes on the floor are overdue for replacement, but fresh rushes cost money and aren't priority when funds are tight. The sweeping is cursory, addressing only the most obvious messes while leaving the general grime that has built up over weeks. The water bucket by the door is nearly empty, requiring a trip to the public well several streets away. This is Marjorie's task, taking 2 wooden buckets and making the walk through streets just beginning to show signs of dawn. The pre-dawn streets are relatively quiet but not empty. Other servants and workers are already moving about, night soil collectors doing their unpleasant rounds, bakers firing up ovens, an occasional drunk still wandering from last night's drinking. The walk to the well requires navigating streets that are dark, muddy, and occasionally dangerous. Marjorie moves quickly, avoiding eye contact with the few men she passes, aware that a woman alone before dawn is vulnerable. The well has a small crowd already, servants like herself filling buckets and exchanging morning greetings and complaints about masters, weather and work. The social moment is brief. Everyone has work waiting, but it's part of the day's human connection. The full buckets are heavy, sloshing water as Marjorie walks carefully back to the tavern. The weight strains her arms and back, reminding her of the physical demands that will fill the rest of the day. She makes 2 trips, filling the large barrel inside the tavern that will supply the day's water for cooking, washing and drinking. Well, for mixing with ale. No one drinks water straight if they can avoid it. By the time the water is fetched, John the taverner has descended from the private chamber he shares with his wife, above the main room. He's a thick-set man in his 40s, his face reddened by years of his own ale consumption, dressed in practical woolen clothing marking him as a tradesman of modest prosperity. His mood varies by day, sometimes jovial, sometimes irritable, occasionally nursing a hangover from his own overindulgence. This morning he's merely businesslike, checking that preparations are proceeding and issuing instructions about the day's work. The brewing woman, Alice, arrives from her nearby home where she brews the ale the tavern serves. She's a widow in her 50s who has contract to supply John's tavern, bringing fresh ale in small barrels that she and Marjorie manoeuvre into position. The brewing is skilled work that Alice learned from her late husband, and that now provides her living. The ale arrives in various qualities: the stronger, better stuff for those who can pay more, and the weaker, cheaper small ale for the majority of customers. The bread arrives next, delivered by the baker's boy who brings the loaves the tavern has contracted for. The bread is yesterday's baking, no longer fresh, but still serviceable and cheaper than today's batch. John inspects the loaves critically, counting them and checking for mould or other problems that would justify refusing payment. The baker's boy is young, perhaps 12, and clearly nervous about any suggestion his delivery is substandard. The bread passes inspection and is stacked in the pantry off the main room. The food preparation begins as light strengthens outside. The tavern's food offerings are simple: pottage, a thick stew of vegetables, grains and occasional meat scraps, bread, cheese, and whatever other provisions John has acquired at good prices. Agnes begins working on the pottage, chopping onions and turnips with a large knife, her eyes watering from the onion fumes. The vegetables go into a large iron pot suspended over the now blazing fire along with water, oats and precious salt. Marjorie sets the tables, placing wooden bowls, spoons and drinking vessels on the rough plank surfaces. The bowls are communal. Each table will share several bowls of pottage, with customers using their own spoons or the tavern's if they lack their own. The drinking vessels are a mix of wooden mugs, ceramic cups and a few pewter tankards for customers who pay premium prices. The vessels are wiped clean with a rag but rarely washed thoroughly. The ale and water are considered sufficient cleaning agents. The work is repetitive and physically demanding. The constant bending to set tables, stirring the heavy pots, hauling water and supplies, creates a baseline of physical exhaustion even before the tavern opens. Marjorie's hands are rough and reddened, her back already aching, her feet cold in the inadequate shoes. She's hungry. The servants won't eat until after the morning rush, and even then they'll get the cheapest food and weakest ale. The atmosphere during preparation is purposeful but not unpleasant. The workers have established rhythms and routines that make the work efficient. Agnes and Marjorie exchange occasional comments and complaints, building the camaraderie that makes the work tolerable. John's wife appears briefly, checking on preparations and issuing some instructions, but she's focused on other household tasks and doesn't linger. The social dynamic is clear. John owns and manages, Alice supplies a crucial resource, and Agnes and Marjorie do the grunt work under supervision. As dawn breaks fully, the tavern is ready for the day's business. The fire burns steadily, providing warmth and cooking heat. The pottage bubbles, filling the room with savoury smells. The ale is positioned for easy access. The tables are set, the floor swept, more or less, and the door unbarred. The establishment is transformed from the cold, dark, lifeless space it was 2 hours ago into a functioning business ready to receive customers. The transformation required 2 hours of hard physical labour by multiple workers, labour that will be mostly invisible to customers who arrive to find everything prepared and ready. The door opens to admit the first customers as the city fully wakes, and the working day begins. The morning trade consists primarily of workers stopping for breakfast, before heading to their own jobs, labourers, craftsmen, and others who need hot food and drink before beginning their own days of physical labour. These customers aren't wealthy, but they have enough coins to afford the tavern's modest prices for services they can't easily provide themselves in crowded tenement rooms without cooking facilities. The first customer is Will, a carpenter who stops at the tavern most mornings. He's a regular, known to Marjorie by name and habit. He takes his usual seat near the fire, nodding to Marjorie as she brings him a bowl of pottage and a mug of small ale without needing to take his order. The familiarity is comfortable. Regulars make the work easier because their preferences are known, and they generally cause no trouble. Will eats quickly, hunched over the bowl, scooping pottage into his mouth with the wooden spoon Marjorie provided, then draining the ale in long gulps. More workers follow, creating a modest morning crowd. Perhaps a dozen men occupy the tables, eating and drinking with the focused attention of hungry labourers. The room fills with sounds of eating, murmured conversations, benches scraping against floor and the crackling fire. The morning light filters through the small glassless windows, adding to the fire's illumination but doing little to warm the room beyond the hearth's immediate radius. Marjorie moves between tables bringing food and refilling ale mugs. The work requires constant movement, serving, clearing empty bowls, refilling drinks, returning to the kitchen area for more supplies, collecting payment. Some customers pay immediately, counting out small coins from purses tied to their belts. Others have credit arrangements with John, their consumption tallied on notched sticks that John maintains, with periodic settlements. The credit creates complex relationships of trust and obligation, with John needing to judge who can be trusted to eventually pay and who might skip out on debts. The interactions with customers vary by individual. Most morning workers are businesslike, focused on eating and getting to their own work. Some are friendly, exchanging pleasantries with Marjorie or making small jokes. A few are sullen or irritable, nursing hangovers or simply having bad mornings. Marjorie has learned to read moods quickly and adjust her interactions accordingly, being cheerful with those who appreciate it, efficiently quiet with those who don't want conversation, and carefully neutral with those whose moods are unclear. The atmosphere is relatively calm compared to later in the day. The morning customers are sober and purposeful, eating quickly and leaving to get to work. There's little drunkenness, no entertainment, and minimal socialising beyond neighbours exchanging brief conversations. The tavern in morning hours functions more like a cafeteria than a social space, providing necessary services to workers who need them and moving people through efficiently. Agnes is in the kitchen area, managing the pottage and bread supplies, making sure there's sufficient food for the morning demand while holding back enough for later. The food planning requires judgment about how many customers to expect and how much to serve each. Serving too generously means running out and needing expensive emergency resupply. Serving too stingily means complaints and poor reputation. Agnes has experience making these calculations, her judgments honed through years of similar work. John circulates through the room, greeting regulars and keeping an eye on operations. His presence has multiple purposes, demonstrating proprietorship, watching for cheating or theft by either customers or workers, and maintaining the social relationships with regulars that keep them returning. He knows most morning customers by name, inquires about their work and families, and maintains the bonds that make his tavern their chosen establishment rather than one of the many alternatives in the city. A travelling peddler enters, a man Marjorie doesn't recognise, carrying his pack of goods for sale. He requests ale and bread, eyeing the room to assess whether this is a good place to display his wares. John approaches him, the conversation brief but pointed. Travelling merchants can sell in the tavern if they pay John a small fee for the privilege of access to his customers. The peddler agrees, pays the fee, and sets up at a corner table, displaying ribbons, needles, small tools, and various other items to the morning customers, some of whom examine his goods while eating. The morning trade brings several women as well, though fewer than men. These women are working women like Marjorie, servants buying food for their masters' households, laundresses getting ale before heading to the river, market women needing breakfast before setting up their stalls. The presence of women without male companions raises no eyebrows in morning hours, when the tavern's functions are clearly practical rather than social. These women are recognised as workers doing necessary tasks, not as disreputable women seeking male company. One morning customer is clearly suffering from excessive drinking the previous night. He sits holding his head, slowly sipping weak ale and nibbling bread, his misery obvious. The sight is common enough that it draws little comment beyond a few jokes from fellow customers about the dangers of overdoing it. The sufferer accepts the ribbing weakly, too miserable to protest. Marjorie refills his ale with something approaching sympathy. She's seen this countless times and recognises that the customer's suffering is real even if self-inflicted. A brief commotion arises when a customer claims his belt purse has been cut, the leather thong sliced by a cut purse who has stolen his coins. The accusation immediately creates tension. If a thief operates in the tavern, all customers are at risk and the tavern's reputation suffers. John investigates, questioning the victim about when he last saw his purse intact, who was sitting near him, whether he's certain the purse was stolen here rather than elsewhere. The investigation is inconclusive. The purse might have been cut in the crowded street before the customer entered, or by someone who has already left or possibly wasn't cut at all, and the customer is creating drama about money lost elsewhere. The incident reminds everyone to watch their belongings, creating a temporary chill in the atmosphere. Customers check their own purses, eye their neighbours with new suspicion, and become more guarded. John loudly declares that his establishment is honest, and that any thief caught on the premises will be turned over to authorities immediately. The declaration is partly reassurance to customers and partly warning to any thief who might be present. The commotion gradually subsides as the immediate crisis passes and the customer with the cut purse leaves, still complaining but accepting there's nothing to be done. By mid-morning, the breakfast rush has largely passed. The workers have eaten and departed to their own jobs, leaving the tavern emptier and quieter. The brief intense period of service gave way to slower hours when the establishment has few customers. Marjorie and Agnes use this time for cleaning tasks postponed during the rush. Wiping tables more thoroughly, sweeping again, washing the dirty bowls and mugs in a barrel of water that quickly becomes greasy and opaque. The washing is unpleasant work. The water is cold, the bowls are greasy and food-stained, and the washing itself is cursory by modern standards. Marjorie uses a rag and elbow grease to remove the worst of the residue, then rinses the vessels in slightly less dirty water. The result is relatively clean rather than truly clean, but the standards are different from modern expectations. No one expects spotless dishes. Removing obvious dirt is sufficient. The lull allows the workers to eat their own meagre breakfast. A bowl of pottage from the pot, weaker than what customers received and containing fewer bits of meat and vegetables. The ale they drink is the weakest, most watered-down version. The bread is the stale stuff from several days ago that wasn't sold. The meal is unsatisfying but fills the stomach, providing energy for the long hours ahead. They eat quickly, aware that customers could arrive at any moment and that eating is subordinate to serving. John's wife descends from the private quarters, surveying the morning's work with critical eye. She checks the pantry, counts the remaining bread loaves, tastes the pottage to assess if it needs more salt or water, and issues instructions about afternoon preparations. Her role is supervisory, overseeing rather than doing the physical work herself. She's higher status than Marjorie and Agnes by virtue of being the taverner's wife, and this status difference is clear in her manner and their responses. She's not cruel, but she's definitely the boss, and the workers show appropriate deference. The morning has been productive and relatively smooth. The customers have been served, payments collected or credit extended, the space kept minimally functional, and no major problems have arisen. This kind of unremarkable success characterises most mornings. The work is hard and the pay is poor, but the routine is familiar and manageable. As the morning progresses toward midday, Marjorie and Agnes prepare for the next rush, when different types of customers will arrive seeking different services, bringing new challenges and interactions that will fill the middle hours of the day. As noon approaches and passes, the tavern enters its busiest period. The midday customers represent a diverse cross-section of urban society, from labourers taking meal breaks, to merchants conducting business, to travellers seeking food and information. The mixture creates an energy and complexity absent during the morning's focused efficiency. The social functions of the tavern become more prominent, as people gather not just to eat, but to socialise, transact business, hear news, and escape the public streets for the relative privacy of an indoor space. The crowd builds steadily as the sun reaches its peak. The tables fill with groups of men engaged in animated conversations, merchants conducting business over ale, artisans from nearby workshops taking breaks together, messengers resting between deliveries, local residents who prefer the tavern's society to their own cramped homes. The noise level rises with more voices competing, laughter erupting from a group hearing a joke, arguments beginning and escalating, the general buzz of human interaction in a confined space. Marjorie is in constant motion during the midday rush, taking orders, remembering who ordered what, bringing food and ale, collecting payments, clearing tables as customers leave to make space for new arrivals, dealing with complaints and special requests, all while trying to remain pleasant and avoid offending customers whose tips and goodwill are important to her income beyond the meagre wages John pays. The mental and physical demands are intense, tracking multiple orders, remembering faces and preferences, calculating what is owed, all while moving continuously through crowded spaces carrying heavy trays and vessels. The physical contact is unavoidable and often unwelcome. Men grab at her as she passes, some in playful but annoying ways, others with clear sexual intent. The grabbing at her arm or waist or backside is constant, requiring navigation between tolerating behaviour that seems relatively harmless and setting boundaries against clearly unacceptable advances. The calculation is delicate. Being too harsh might offend customers John wants to keep, but being too permissive invites escalating harassment. Marjorie has developed strategies, twisting away from grasping hands, laughing off mild advances while being firmer about serious ones, enlisting John's intervention when a customer goes too far. One customer, a regular named Hugh, is particularly persistent in his attentions. He's a cloth merchant with sufficient means to drink good ale and eat well, and he's made clear his interest in Marjorie's company beyond her serving duties. Today he tries to pull her onto his lap as she serves his table, an advance she deflects by twisting away and making a joke that maintains good humour while establishing a boundary. Hugh is drunk enough to be persistent, but not so drunk that he's dangerous, a state Marjorie has learned to judge carefully. The food service is more complex at midday than morning. Some customers order only ale, others want both food and drink. Some share food among groups while others eat individually. The bread and cheese orders are straightforward, but the pottage requires bringing bowls and ensuring sufficient food in each bowl to satisfy without being so generous as to waste the establishment's resources. Agnes struggles to keep up with demand, ladling pottage while also managing the fire and preparing additional food as supplies run low. A group of travelling merchants from Flanders occupies a large table, speaking among themselves in their own language, while occasionally trying to communicate with Marjorie in broken English. They're here on business, trading wool and cloth, and they have money to spend on good ale and proper food. John personally serves this table, recognising their value as paying customers, and also hoping to learn news from Flanders that might affect the wool trade, information that can be valuable in itself, or profitable when shared with others. The noise level has grown loud enough that conversation requires raised voices. The acoustics of the room, with its low ceiling and hard surfaces, amplify sound rather than absorbing it. The result is a constant roar of voices, laughter, disputes, and the clatter of dishes and furniture. The noise is simultaneously alive and exhausting, the energy of human sociability at its peaks alongside the sensory assault of too many people in too small a space. A quarrel erupts between two customers over a gambling debt. One accuses the other of cheating at dice, the other responds with insults, and within moments both men are standing and shouting, hands on knife hilts. The room's attention shifts to the conflict, conversations pausing as people watch to see if violence will erupt. John moves quickly toward the dispute, his size and authority allowing him to interpose himself between the angry men. His intervention combines physical presence, loud declarations about keeping peace in his establishment, and practical reminders that fighting will get both men thrown out and possibly reported to authorities. The confrontation de-escalates but slowly, with both men saving face through final insults and threats before being separated to opposite sides of the room. The violence was avoided, but the possibility was real and would have resulted in bloodshed if John hadn't intervened effectively. The near fight reminds everyone that taverns are volatile spaces where alcohol, money, male pride and weapons combine dangerously. Marjorie felt real fear during the confrontation. Had fighting begun, anyone nearby could have been injured by flailing weapons in the crowded space. The atmosphere after the confrontation is tense and charged, conversation more subdued as people process what almost happened. But gradually the energy rebuilds as drinking continues and new arrivals unaware of the near-fight change the room's mood. The resilience of tavern atmosphere, its ability to absorb disruption and return to something like normal, is remarkable and necessary given how frequently disturbances occur. A woman enters alone, clearly looking for someone. She scans the room, spots a man drinking with companions and approaches him. The confrontation is immediate and public. She's his wife, and she's here demanding he come home and stop wasting money on ale when the family needs every coin. The husband is embarrassed, his friends amused and mocking, and the wife furious. The domestic dispute plays out in front of the entire tavern, with the wife ultimately dragging her reluctant husband out the door, while his friends call jibes about being under his wife's thumb. The incident is simultaneously serious and entertaining to onlookers. The serious dimension involves real family conflict over money and drinking, issues that plague many households. The entertaining dimension involves the public spectacle and the husband's humiliation, which provides amusement to those who aren't directly involved. Marjorie feels some sympathy for both, the wife trying to manage household finances, the husband wanting social time with friends. The incident is ordinary enough that it barely interrupts the overall flow of tavern life. A minstrel enters, hoping to perform for tips. He's a young man with a small harp, dressed in worn but colourful clothing, his profession marginal, and his income precarious. He approaches John to negotiate. Can he perform? John assesses the room, decides that entertainment might be welcome and might keep customers drinking longer, and agrees on condition that the minstrel gets tips only, no fee from the house. The minstrel accepts these terms and finds a corner where he can be seen and heard. The performance begins with a popular ballad about a knight's adventures. Some customers pay attention, some ignore him completely, and most fall somewhere between. The music provides pleasant background without commanding full attention. After several songs, the minstrel circulates with his hat, collecting small coins from those who appreciated the entertainment. The collection is modest, but not nothing, enough to make the performance worthwhile. The minstrel will move on to another establishment later, making his living through these small accumulations. The midday peak extends through early afternoon, with the crowd gradually thinning as people return to work or other business. The intensity of service lessens as fewer customers demand attention, though the tavern remains moderately busy. Marjorie's feet ache, her arms are tired from carrying heavy trays, her head pounds from the noise, and she's hungry again despite having eaten a modest midday meal during a brief lull. The afternoon stretches ahead with more work before she can rest. As the midday rush subsides, Marjorie has a moment to catch her breath. Agnes is preparing for evening service, checking supplies and assessing what will be needed as the day progresses. John is settling accounts with the Flemish merchants who are preparing to leave. The tavern has successfully navigated its busiest hours, serving dozens of customers, collecting substantial revenue, avoiding major incidents beyond the near fight, and maintaining the reputation and operations that will bring customers back tomorrow. The midday success came through hard work, careful management, and a bit of luck that nothing went seriously wrong. The afternoon will bring different challenges and different types of customers as the day's rhythm continues its cycle. The afternoon settles into a different rhythm as the midday rush passes and before the evening crowd arrives. These middle hours are neither dead nor overwhelmingly busy, creating a mixed atmosphere where the tavern serves multiple functions simultaneously. The afternoon customers are more diverse than morning or midday crowds, including those whose schedules don't match regular working hours, those who make taverns their primary social space, and those seeking services beyond food and drink. Several regular afternoon patrons occupy their customary places. Old Thomas sits near the fire, as he does every afternoon, nursing a single mug of ale that lasts hours while he dozes, occasionally waking to make comments about current conversations or to tell stories about the old days. He's tolerated because he's harmless, because his presence is tradition, and because he does eventually pay for his ale even if he makes it last absurdly long. His role is partly social landmark, everyone knows Thomas, and his presence provides continuity and familiarity. A group of younger men, probably apprentices or journey craftsmen, play dice at one table. The gambling is technically illegal, but enforcement is lax, and John tolerates it as long as they buy ale, and don't get too loud or violent when disputes arise. The dice clatter across the table, accompanied by groans of disappointment and crows of triumph. Money changes hands in small amounts, some players winning while others lose. The gaming will continue for hours, the players' consumption of ale steady if not rapid, making them profitable customers despite occupying a table that could potentially serve more people. Two women sit together at another table, speaking quietly and intensely. They're neighbourhood women, likely married, taking a rare opportunity to talk outside their homes. They're not drinking workers grabbing quick refreshment, but rather women using the tavern as social space, seeking privacy that their crowded homes don't provide. Their consumption is modest, a shared pot of ale, some bread, but their presence is notable because respectable married women in taverns during afternoon hours are less common than in morning's purposeful rush. A lone traveller sits studying a letter, occasionally looking up to gaze out the door toward the street. He's clearly waiting for someone, checking the door whenever it opens, his body language showing impatience or anxiety. The afternoon tavern serves as meeting place and way station, where people arrange to gather, wait for appointments, and conduct business that requires neutral ground. The traveller orders ale periodically, more to maintain his right to occupy space than from thirst, paying without complaint and requesting nothing beyond to be left alone. Agnes is working on the evening's preparations. The pottage pot is being refreshed, yesterday's remnants augmented with new vegetables, more water, additional oats to stretch the mixture. The bread supply is checked and found adequate for evening trade. The ale barrels are inspected with calculations about whether current supply will suffice, or whether another barrel from Alice's supply will be needed. The preparation work is less intense than morning's frantic rush, but requires attention and judgment about quantities and timing. Marjorie takes advantage of the slower pace to sit briefly, her feet crying out for rest after hours of constant standing and walking. She eats a piece of bread, drinks some watered ale, and exchanges quiet conversation with Agnes about the day's customers, the near fight at midday, John's mood, and the mundane details of their working lives. These moments of respite are precious, allowing physical and mental recovery before the evening's demands. A beggar appears at the door asking for charity. John's response is sharp. "No beggars. Get out. Stop blocking the entrance." The beggar pleads, claims he's a veteran crippled in the King's Wars, deserves consideration from Christian people. John's charity is limited and conditional. He can't feed every beggar in the city or his business would fail, but complete heartlessness is also not good for reputation. He allows Marjorie to give the beggar some stale bread and a cup of weak ale, then firmly but not violently encourages the man to leave. The interaction is witnessed by customers, John's handling balancing business sense with minimal Christian charity. A prostitute enters, a woman Marjorie knows by sight, looking for customers, or perhaps just getting ale. Her presence is complicated. Prostitution is illegal but widespread, and taverns are common places for prostitutes to find customers. John's position is pragmatic. He tolerates their presence as long as they buy drinks and don't conduct business on the premises. The prostitute orders ale, drinks it while surveying the room, and leaves without incident. Her brief presence made some male customers uncomfortable, others interested, and created a moment of moral ambiguity about what's tolerated in the tavern's social space. A merchant arrives with a small entourage of servants and clerks, requesting private space for business discussions. John directs them to a corner table away from others, a location that provides some privacy in the open room. The merchant and his associates begin discussing what appears to be a business contract, speaking in lowered voices, examining documents, and occasionally calling for more ale. The tavern serves as office and meeting room for those without dedicated business spaces, its semi-public nature providing neutral ground for negotiations. The afternoon conversation among regular customers touches on various topics. Local politics. There's a dispute about taxes the king is levying. Gossip about neighbours, who was seen entering whose house in the middle of the night suggesting adultery. News from the war, the king's forces have won a battle in France or maybe lost one, accounts vary. Complaints about the weather, it's been too wet, the roads are terrible, and endless other subjects. Marjorie hears these conversations as background noise while working, absorbing information about the world beyond the tavern through these public discussions. A fight breaks out between a customer and a dog. A stray dog wandered in, attracted by food smells, and began begging aggressively at a table. When shoved away by a customer, the dog bit him, and the customer kicked the dog viciously. The dog yelped and retreated. The customer is bleeding from the bite, and the incident creates commotion. The customer's companions help him bind his bite wound while speculating about whether the dog was rabid. Probably not, but the fear is real. The injured man leaves to seek medical attention or perhaps just to go home and clean the wound. The dog escaped out the door and isn't seen again. An itinerant preacher appears at the door, one of the unauthorized religious enthusiasts who occasionally travel through towns preaching reform and condemning sin. He begins a sermon about the evils of drink, gambling, lust, and general moral decay, with the tavern serving as perfect target for his condemnations. The customers' responses range from ignoring him to heckling to engaging in debate. John is torn. The preacher is bad for business, but throwing out religious figures, even unauthorized ones, risks accusations of impiety. The situation resolves itself when the preacher, getting limited response and considerable mockery, moves on to find more receptive audiences. As afternoon progresses toward evening, the customer mix shifts. The afternoon regulars remain. Tom is still dozing by the fire, the gamblers still at their dice, but new customers begin arriving. Workers finishing their day's labour, locals beginning their evening routines, travellers checking in for lodging. The transition from afternoon to evening is gradual, marked by changing light through the windows, shifting customer demographics, and the building energy as the approach of night brings different social dynamics. Marjorie prepares for evening by checking supplies, ensuring clean dishes and mugs are available, making sure the fire is burning properly, and generally readying herself mentally for the peak hours ahead. Agnes continues cooking preparations, knowing that evening hunger will bring customers seeking hot food. John changes into slightly nicer clothing, preparing for evening's role as host and manager of what will hopefully be a profitable night. The afternoon has served its functions, keeping the tavern open and generating revenue during slower hours, providing space for various social and business activities, maintaining continuity between the day's peak periods. As evening approaches, the anticipation of busier times ahead creates subtle tension in preparation for what's coming. As darkness falls and candles are lit throughout the tavern, the establishment enters its most vibrant and potentially profitable hours. The evening customers seek more than food and drink. They're looking for entertainment, social connection, escape from labour's demands, and the various pleasures that tavern life offers. The atmosphere becomes more festive and also more dangerous as alcohol consumption increases, inhibitions decrease, and the mix of people creates friction alongside camaraderie. The room fills rapidly as workers complete their days and head to the tavern rather than going straight home. The choice to spend evening hours and precious coins at the tavern rather than with family reflects various motivations. Homes are crowded and offer little privacy or comfort. Tavern society is more enjoyable than domestic duties. The tavern offers entertainment and social status unavailable at home, and sometimes simply the desire to drink without spousal oversight drives men to taverns. The evening crowd is predominantly male, though some women are present as workers like Marjorie, as prostitutes seeking customers, or as wives dragging husbands home. The noise level reaches its evening peak, with dozens of conversations competing, laughter frequent and loud, occasional shouts and arguments, the clatter of dishes and furniture, and the general roar of human social interaction in an enclosed space. The din is overwhelming, making conversation require raised voices and creating an atmosphere of barely controlled chaos. The acoustic environment assaults the ears, while simultaneously creating the energy and vibrancy that makes the tavern exciting rather than merely loud. Marjorie is in constant motion, serving customers as quickly as she can while they demand attention impatiently. The evening crowd is less polite than midday customers, made bold by alcohol and emboldened by darkness. The grabbing and verbal harassment intensifies, with more overt sexual comments and physical advances. Marjorie navigates this environment with practiced skill, but the constant navigation is exhausting and demeaning. She's learned which customers can be handled with jokes, which require firm refusals, and which are dangerous enough to require John's intervention. The entertainment takes various forms. The minstrel from earlier has returned for evening performance, now joined by another musician with a drum. The two perform together, creating louder and more festive music suited to the evening atmosphere. Some customers sing along with familiar songs. A space clears in the room's centre, where an impromptu dance begins, men dancing with each other in absence of female partners, the dancing more energetic and less skilled as drinking continues. Two customers begin an arm wrestling contest at one table, attracting spectators who place bets on the outcome. The contest becomes increasingly intense, with both competitors straining and sweating, their faces reddened with effort, spectators shouting encouragement to their chosen champion. Money changes hands among bettors as one man finally overcomes the other, his victory celebrated with cheers and another round of drinks. The contest will spawn imitators as other customers try to prove their own strength. A group of young men, clearly already drunk, enters noisily. They're city youths from decent families, out carousing and looking for excitement. Their boisterous energy immediately affects the room's dynamic. They're loud, demanding, and potentially troublesome. John watches them carefully, aware that this demographic can be profitable. They spend freely when drinking, but also problematic. They cause disturbances and sometimes don't pay. The balance between welcoming their business and controlling their behaviour requires careful management. The food service continues, but is less central than ale consumption. Most evening customers are drinking rather than eating, though some order bread and cheese to accompany their ale. The bread soaks up alcohol somewhat, allowing more prolonged drinking without complete drunkenness. The cheese is popular because it makes customers thirsty, encouraging more ale purchases. Agnes brings out additional food supplies as the evening crowd depletes stocks, her estimates about evening demand being tested. A fight almost erupts when one customer bumps another, spilling ale down his front. The victim is angry, demanding compensation for the wasted drink and the insult. The clumsy customer apologises, but somewhat drunkenly, which doesn't satisfy the victim. Friends of both men intervene, some trying to calm the situation while others encourage the confrontation. The tension builds until John personally intervenes, his authority and physical presence sufficient to prevent violence. He offers to replace the spilled ale at his own expense, a peace offering that satisfies the victim enough to drop the matter. The prostitutes are more visible in evening hours, several women working the room with varying degrees of subtlety. They drink ale, chat with customers, and negotiate terms for services to be provided elsewhere. John doesn't allow prostitution on premises, but tacitly permits solicitation, as long as it's not too blatant. The presence of prostitutes adds to the tavern's atmosphere of illicit pleasure, while creating moral ambiguity that more respectable citizens condemn. Some customers are clearly here specifically to meet prostitutes, while others ignore their presence or actively disapprove. A travelling merchant attempts to display his wares, but the evening crowd is less interested in commerce than midday customers were. People are here to drink and socialise, not to shop. The merchant's attempts to draw attention are largely unsuccessful, and he eventually packs up and leaves, muttering about wasted time. The evening tavern serves different functions than daylight hours, and activities appropriate at midday seem out of place in evening's festive atmosphere. The candles and fire provide the only illumination, creating dramatic shadows and pools of darkness in corners. The lighting is sufficient for general navigation, but inadequate for fine work or reading. The flickering light adds to the atmosphere while making it difficult to see clearly. People's faces are partially shadowed, expressions harder to read, the general visual environment more mysterious and potentially dangerous than daytime's clearer visibility. An argument begins about politics, the king's governance, taxes, the war with France, subjects that are simultaneously important and dangerous to discuss too openly. The customers debating are passionate, their voices rising, their positions increasingly extreme as alcohol affects their judgment. The arguments could be merely heated discussion, or could escalate to violence or even to dangerous seditious talk that could bring authorities' attention. John monitors the discussion, ready to intervene if it becomes either too violent or too political. A customer collapses, too drunk to remain upright. His companions laugh, prop him against the wall, and continue drinking while he snores. The unconscious drunk is commonplace enough that his presence barely registers. He's not the first customer to drink himself insensate tonight, and probably won't be the last. As long as he doesn't block passage or create other problems, he'll be allowed to sleep it off. His friends will presumably take responsibility for getting him home eventually, though whether they actually will remains to be seen. The evening represents the tavern at its most alive, and also its most problematic. The energy and entertainment draw customers who spend money freely, making these hours potentially very profitable. Yet the drunkenness, violence, vice, and various problems also reach their peak, requiring constant vigilance and management. Marjorie is exhausted, her feet aching unbearably, her patience worn thin by constant harassment, her body and mind begging for rest. Yet the evening continues, customers keep ordering, and the work goes on. As the evening progresses toward night, some customers begin leaving. Workers who must rise early tomorrow, men whose wives or masters expect them home, travellers seeking lodging elsewhere or retiring to rooms upstairs. But others arrive, and the tavern remains full and chaotic. The peak evening hours extend late into the night, with the establishment staying open as long as customers are drinking and paying. The boundary between evening and night is fuzzy, marked more by deepening darkness and progressing drunkenness than by any clear transition point. As the night deepens well past any reasonable hour, the tavern's character darkens along with the hour. The late-night customers are primarily serious drinkers, those who have nowhere else to be, people avoiding going home, and individuals whose activities prefer darkness's cover. The atmosphere becomes more potentially dangerous as the most moderate customers have departed, leaving those whose judgment is most impaired by alcohol and whose intentions are sometimes questionable. The crowd has thinned, but the remaining customers are the most thoroughly drunk. Speech is slurred, movements uncoordinated, tempers short. The conversation has devolved into repetitive rambling, boastful stories that grow more exaggerated with each telling, and arguments over trivial matters that seem momentous to drunken minds. The intellectual and social quality of interaction has declined as sobriety has disappeared, leaving the ugly side of drinking more visible. A serious fight erupts between two men over something trivial. One claims the other looked at him wrong, or bumped him intentionally, or insulted his honour through some perceived slight that wouldn't register with sober minds. The fight escalates from words to shoving to punches before John and several customers can intervene. One man's nose is bleeding, the other has split knuckles, and both are being held back by those trying to prevent further violence. John is furious. Fighting is bad for business and could bring authorities, and he throws both men out forcefully, banning them from returning. The ejected men continue fighting in the street, their shouts audible from inside. The street violence is no longer John's problem, though if someone is seriously injured or killed, the association with his tavern could still bring trouble. The customers inside discuss the fight, some critical of John for throwing out paying customers, others supportive of his decision to maintain order. The incident hangs over the room, a reminder that the veneer of civilization is thin in late-night tavern environments. The prostitutes are more aggressive in their solicitations now, approaching customers more directly. Most transactions have been concluded earlier, but late-night customers offer final opportunities for business. The women negotiate with varying success, some finding customers, others being rejected or ignored. The late-night prostitution is more desperate and sad than the earlier evening's business, with both prostitutes and customers displaying the degradation that accompanies this hour. Marjorie is almost beyond exhaustion, operating on automatic, her body moving through familiar motions while her mind has partially shut down to cope with fatigue. She makes mistakes, brings ale to the wrong customer, miscalculates what's owed, forgets orders. But the customers are too drunk to notice or care much. Her primary focus has narrowed to just getting through the night, surviving until she can finally stop working and collapse into her uncomfortable bed upstairs. A customer becomes sexually aggressive with Marjorie, grabbing her firmly and trying to pull her close, his intentions clear and threatening. Her attempts to deflect and escape are unsuccessful. He's strong and determined, emboldened by alcohol and darkness. She calls for help, her voice sharp with genuine fear. John intervenes quickly, physically removing the customer's hands and forcefully pushing him away, issuing threats about what will happen if he touches the serving women again. The customer backs off, muttering complaints but unwilling to fight John. The incident leaves Marjorie shaken, the physical assault a reminder of her vulnerability in this environment. The incident also reveals the complex social dynamics. John protected Marjorie partly from genuine care for her welfare, partly because assault on his workers reflects badly on his establishment, and partly because he can't allow customers to believe they can do whatever they want. Yet John's protection is limited and conditional. He won't intervene in all harassment, only when it crosses lines he's defined. Marjorie knows she must generally cope with harassment herself, calling for help only when truly necessary, or when customers cross into serious assault territory. A customer passes out completely, slumping over a table. John checks whether he's just sleeping or seriously ill. Sometimes people drink themselves into dangerous conditions requiring medical attention. This customer seems merely unconscious from drink, so he's left to sleep it off. His purse is checked to ensure he can pay his bill, and finding sufficient coins, his debt is settled. He'll wake eventually, probably with terrible hangover, and will stagger home or perhaps sleep in the tavern until morning. The late-night hours reveal the tavern's role as refuge for those with nowhere else to go. Some customers seem to live primarily in taverns, spending every evening and late-night drinking. Their homes, if they have them, being merely places to sleep briefly. These chronic tavern dwellers are known to staff, their patterns familiar, their problems visible. They're profitable customers in one sense, spending money regularly, but also troubling cases of wasted lives and damaged people. A group of night watchmen enters, making their rounds and checking establishments. They're looking for violations of curfew regulations, criminal activity, or disturbances that need addressing. John greets them respectfully, offering ale that they accept, and assures them everything is orderly. The watchmen survey the room, their presence temporarily sobering the atmosphere, then move on to continue their rounds. Their visit is routine but serves as a reminder that taverns operate under official scrutiny, and that license to remain open can be revoked if problems become too severe. As the night extends toward dawn, even the hardiest drinkers begin to flag. Customers settle their bills or have them added to their credit tallies, and slowly depart into the dangerous nighttime streets. The tavern empties gradually, the noise declining, the energy dissipating. The last customers are often the most problematic, too drunk to realise they should leave, lacking homes to go to, or simply unwilling to face whatever awaits them outside. Finally, John declares the tavern closed, announcing last call and firmly encouraging remaining customers to leave. Most comply with varying degrees of cooperation, gathering belongings and stumbling toward the door. One customer needs to be physically assisted out, too drunk to navigate independently. Another tries to argue for one more drink, but gives up when John remains firm. The clearing of the last customers marks the approaching end of the workday, though significant work remains before Marjorie can rest. The late-night hours reveal the tavern at its worst, the violence, degradation, exploitation, and various human problems that flourish in alcohol-soaked environments after dark. The romantic tavern of popular imagination disappeared entirely, replaced by something grittier and sadder. Yet these hours also generated substantial revenue, with late-night customers drinking heavily and paying high prices for the privilege of continuing past reasonable hours. The financial logic of staying open late was compelling even as the human costs were considerable. With the last customer finally out the door and the bar secured, the work of closing begins. Contrary to what customers might imagine, simply ejecting them doesn't mean the worker's day ends. The tavern must be cleaned, supplies secured, accounts settled, and preparations made for the following day's opening. This closing work is unglamorous but essential, and it falls primarily to Marjorie and Agnes, while John handles the financial accounting. The first task is securing the money and valuables. John collects the day's receipts, counting coins carefully, and recording amounts in his account book. He checks credit tallies against memory and notch sticks, verifying who owes what. The accounting is meticulous because discrepancies in money mean either theft or incompetent record keeping, both of which threaten the business's viability. John's wife joins him for this counting, the two working together to reconcile the day's business and assess profitability. While John counts money, Marjorie and Agnes begin cleaning. The tables must be cleared of all dishes and debris. The floor needs sweeping again, more thoroughly than the cursory midday efforts. The dishes require washing in water that's now cold and even more foul than earlier. The ale barrels must be sealed and returned to storage positions. The fire must be banked properly to preserve coals for tomorrow, while ensuring the building doesn't burn down overnight. The cleaning work is exhausting after a 16-hour day already filled with constant movement. Marjorie's body screams for rest, but the work must be finished. She scrubs tables with more force than is strictly necessary, anger at the day's harassment and indignities flowing into the physical labour. Agnes works silently, beyond conversation, focused simply on completing tasks so she can sleep. The physical condition of the tavern after a full day's business is appalling. The floors are sticky with spilled ale, littered with food scraps and other debris, and stained with substances better left unexamined. The tables are greasy, marked with burns from carelessly placed candles, and scratched from years of hard use. The dishes are encrusted with food remains. The overall smell is a mix of stale ale, smoke, sweat, food, and various bodily odours. The cleaning improves matters, but can't fully address the accumulated grime that permeates the space. The rushes on the floor, which should be replaced regularly, are in poor condition. They're supposed to absorb spills and make the earthen floor more comfortable, but instead they've become sodden and foul, contributing to rather than solving the tavern's hygiene problems. Marjorie sweeps the worst of the surface debris into piles for removal, but knows the rushes themselves need complete replacement, a task that costs money and requires significant labour, so it's postponed for another day. As Marjorie works, she thinks about the day's events, the near fights, the harassment she endured. the brief satisfactions of friendly interactions with decent customers, the physical exhaustion that fills her entire body. She thinks about the coins in her purse. Her wages are meagre and supplemented by occasional tips from grateful customers. The money will go toward necessities, and hopefully leave a little to save against future needs. The financial precariousness of her position is ever present. She has no security beyond her ability to work, and illness or injury could leave her destitute. John completes his accounting and announces the day's results. The tavern made a decent profit. Not exceptional, but solid. Enough to cover costs and provide income for John's household and wages for his workers. He seems satisfied, having managed the day without major disasters and having extracted reasonable profit from the steady stream of customers. His satisfaction doesn't translate into exceptional gratitude to the workers whose labour made the profits possible, but he's not actively hostile either. The relationship is transactional. They work, he pays wages, the arrangement continues as long as it serves both parties. The final preparations for tomorrow begin. Agnes checks that sufficient ale is accessible for morning service. The bread order for tomorrow is confirmed with John. The pottage pot is assessed. Tomorrow's cooking will build on tonight's base, with new ingredients added to the existing foundation. The tavern operating on thin margins means nothing is wasted, with each day's remnants becoming next day's foundation. Marjorie takes a final look around the main room, checking that everything is secured and ready. The candles are extinguished, leaving only dim light from banked fire coals. The room looks tired and worn in the low light, the shabbiness more apparent without crowds and activity to distract from the physical space's limitations. Yet there's also something peaceful about the quiet, empty room after hours of chaos, a moment of stillness before tomorrow's cycle begins again. The final task is securing the building itself. The door is barred from inside, the windows secured, and John makes a final inspection, ensuring no fire hazards remain, and no intruders could enter easily. The tavern represents his livelihood and his family's security, so proper closing procedures are important despite exhaustion. With the building secured, everyone can finally retire to their sleeping spaces. Marjorie and Agnes climb the ladder to their attic room, bodies aching and minds beyond thought. They collapse onto their straw mattresses, not bothering to remove outer clothing, too exhausted for anything beyond immediate surrender to sleep. The single blanket they share provides inadequate warmth, but they're too tired to care. Within moments of lying down, both women are asleep, escaping the day's hardships into unconsciousness that will last only a few hours before the pre-dawn wake-up begins tomorrow's cycle. John and his wife retire to their private chamber, their accommodations far superior to the servants' attic space. They discuss the day briefly. The profits were acceptable, no major disasters occurred. The Flemish merchants were good customers, the neophytes were concerning but managed. They make plans for tomorrow, discuss longer-term business issues, and eventually sleep, their rest somewhat more comfortable than their workers, but still interrupted by worries about business, competition, regulations, and the countless challenges of operating a tavern in medieval city. The building settles into nighttime quiet, the creaks and groans of wooden structure the only sounds. The banked fire glows faintly, providing minimal warmth to the empty room. Outside, the city sleeps fitfully, with only night watchmen and those with questionable business moving through dark streets. The tavern has completed another daily cycle, surviving and generating profit, serving its community's needs while extracting labour and coin from everyone involved. Tomorrow will bring a nearly identical day. Same routines, similar customers, familiar challenges. The day after will repeat again. This is the rhythm of tavern life. Endless repetition of serving, cleaning, managing, surviving, with only occasional unusual events breaking the pattern. The tavern wasn't merely a workplace, but a complex social environment, where relationships, hierarchies, and various forms of human connection shaped daily experience as much as the work itself. Understanding these social dimensions reveals that tavern life was profoundly relational, with success depending on navigating webs of social obligations, expectations, and conflicts that extended far beyond simple economic transactions. Marjorie's relationship with John the Taverner was fundamentally hierarchical. He was master, she was servant, and that power differential shaped every interaction. Yet the relationship had nuances beyond simple domination. John depended on Marjorie's labour and had incentive to keep her reasonably satisfied so she wouldn't leave for another position. Marjorie needed John's goodwill because he controlled her wages, her housing, and references she'd need for future employment. The mutual dependency created a relationship that was simultaneously exploitative and cooperative. John's behaviour toward his workers ranged from relatively decent to casually cruel, depending on his mood, business pressures, and individual circumstances. When profits were good and business smooth, he might be almost friendly, making jokes or offering small privileges like better food. When stressed by financial problems or regulatory troubles, he became harsh and demanding, criticising work harshly and threatening termination. Marjorie learned to read his moods and adjust her behaviour accordingly, being more efficient and deferential when he was irritable, more relaxed when he was in good spirits. The relationship between Marjorie and Agnes was one of solidarity born from shared hardship. They worked together, slept in the same room, and dealt with similar challenges and mistreatment. The friendship provided emotional support that made difficult work more bearable. They shared complaints about John, about customers, about their lives, creating bonds through mutual recognition of shared experiences. They also competed subtly for John's favour and for tips from customers, the competition creating tension within their friendship that was never fully resolved. Agnes was older and more experienced, having worked at the Tavern for 7 years versus Marjorie's 3. This seniority gave Agnes informal authority that Marjorie generally accepted. Agnes taught Marjorie skills when she first arrived, instructed her about customers' habits and preferences, and shared knowledge about tavern work accumulated through experience. Marjorie deferred to Agnes on work questions while occasionally resenting the implied hierarchy in their relationship. The relationship with John's wife was complicated by gender and class. She was female like Marjorie and Agnes, but of higher status through marriage. She supervised the female workers, judging their work and behaviour. Her relationship to Marjorie combined elements of mistress-servant dynamics with recognition of shared female experience in a male-dominated environment. She was rarely cruel, but maintained clear status distance, making sure the servants understood their subordinate positions. The regular customers created another layer of relationships. Marjorie knew many regulars by name, knew their habits and preferences, remembered their families and circumstances. These relationships were simultaneously commercial and personal. The regulars' tips and willingness to defend her when other customers got too aggressive made maintaining good relationships with them important. Yet the relationships were constrained by class and the service context. Marjorie couldn't forget that these were customers whose goodwill was contingent on good service. Some customers clearly saw Marjorie as potential sexual conquest, their friendliness being thinly veiled attempts at seduction. Others seemed genuinely friendly in more innocent ways, treating her as a human being worth talking to rather than merely a serving wench. Still others were simply transactional, ordering drinks and paying without any personal interaction beyond what was necessary. Learning to distinguish these categories and respond appropriately required social intelligence and constant attention to subtle cues. The relationship with Hugh, the persistent cloth merchant, was particularly complex. His interest was clearly sexual, but he also treated Marjorie with more respect than most customers, paid well, tipped generously, and defended her against other customers' worst behaviour. The transactional nature of his kindness was obvious. He was buying goodwill, hoping it would eventually buy sexual access, but his protection and generosity were nonetheless valuable. Marjorie managed the relationship by accepting his patronage while firmly declining his sexual propositions, a balance that maintained his interest and generosity while, so far, not leading to situations she couldn't control. The other tavern workers in the neighbourhood formed an informal community. When Marjorie went to the well in morning, or did errands during lulls, she encountered workers from other establishments. They exchanged information about job opportunities, compared working conditions and wages, shared strategies for dealing with difficult customers, and generally created solidarity among people doing similar work. This informal community provided support and information that individual workers desperately needed in the absence of any formal worker organisations. The relationship with Alice, the brewing woman, was professional but cordial. Alice was an independent businesswoman rather than an employee, giving her higher status than Marjorie despite similar social class origins. Alice had survived her husband, maintained her brewing business, and earned decent living through her skilled work. she represented a potential future for Marjorie, widowhood that paradoxically offered independence and economic opportunity. Their interactions mixed business transactions with the mutual recognition of women making their ways in commercial worlds. The social hierarchies within the tavern were multiple and overlapping. John stood at the top as owner and master. His wife ranked next, managing domestic aspects while supporting her husband's business. Alice held independent status through her business relationship. Agnes, as senior worker, ranked above Marjorie in the servant hierarchy. Regular customers had status through their patronage and the relationships they'd established. Casual customers ranked at the bottom, entitled to service but claiming no special treatment. These hierarchies were complex and sometimes contradictory, requiring constant navigation of competing status claims. The relationship with authorities was distant but important. The city officials who regulated taverns were remote figures whose regulations affected daily operations without the officials ever being present. The night watchmen who made occasional appearances represented state authorities' nearest regular manifestation. The relationship with authorities was one of wary compliance, following regulations enough to avoid serious trouble while skirting rules when possible to maintain profitability. The neighbourhood relationships mattered because taverns were embedded in local communities. The neighbours included customers, competitors, other taverns nearby, suppliers, and various other people whose goodwill or hostility affected business. John cultivated these relationships carefully, being generous when he could afford it, providing charity in measured doses, and generally maintaining the social connections that kept his tavern accepted by the neighbourhood despite the problems taverns inevitably created. The sexual dynamics in the tavern were pervasive and complex. The constant male sexual attention directed at female workers was harassment and assault by modern standards, but was simply expected occupational hazard in medieval context. Marjorie had no concept of sexual harassment as a distinct category of wrongdoing. The grabbing, comments and propositions were just part of tavern work that she had to endure and manage. Her strategies for managing male attention range from humour to firmness to occasional violence. A well-timed elbow could discourage grabby customers to enlisting John's intervention when necessary. The friendships with customers occasionally deepened into genuine relationships beyond service contexts. A few regular customers saw Marjorie as a person rather than merely a servant, asked about her life beyond work, and treated her with respect that transcended the service relationship. These friendships were constrained by class and context. They couldn't extend beyond the tavern into broader social life, but they provided moments of genuine human connection that made the work less dehumanizing. The conflicts with customers range from minor irritations to serious confrontations. Some conflicts arose from legitimate complaints about service quality or prices. Others resulted from customers' drunkenness, misogyny, or general unpleasantness. Marjorie developed thick skin for insults and learned when to fight back verbally, when to ignore behaviour, and when to seek help. The constant low-level conflict created stress, but was so normal that she barely registered it consciously most of the time. The competition with other taverns affected relationships in subtle ways. John was always aware of what nearby taverns charged, what entertainment they offered, and how their reputations compared to his. He adjusted prices, tried to provide better service or entertainment, and generally attempted to compete effectively. The workers were aware that their tavern's success determined their employment security, creating incentive to work hard even beyond John's direct supervision. Understanding the social world of the tavern reveals that the work wasn't just about serving food and drink, but about navigating complex human relationships across hierarchies of gender, class, age, and status. Success required not just physical skills but also social intelligence, emotional management, and the ability to maintain appropriate relationships with diverse people under difficult circumstances. The social dimensions were simultaneously some of the best and worst aspects of tavern work. The human connection and camaraderie made the work bearable, while the exploitation, harassment, and hierarchical subordination made it difficult and demeaning. Marjorie's existence extended beyond her working hours, though those hours consumed so much of her day that personal life was severely constrained. Understanding what little personal time and space she carved out reveals both the poverty and limitations of her existence, and her resilience in finding moments of meaning and connection, despite difficult circumstances. Her physical living space in the attic was barely adequate. The room measured perhaps 8 feet by 10, with a sloped roof that made standing upright possible only in the centre. The 2 straw mattresses occupied most of the floor space. The single small chest contained her worldly possessions, 2 additional shifts, a slightly nicer dress for holy days, several head coverings, her hairbrush, a small mirror, a prized possession though the reflection it provided was dim, and a few small items of sentimental value. This was everything she owned, the entirety of her material existence beyond the clothes she wore. The mattresses were infested with lice and fleas despite her efforts to keep them clean. The straw needed replacing regularly but often wasn't, becoming compressed and uncomfortable. The single blanket was worn thin and inadequate for winter cold. The room's temperature was only slightly better than outside, with no heating beyond whatever warmth rose from the tavern below. In winter, she often woke with frost on the walls. In summer, the attic was stifling, the heat trapped under the roof making sleep difficult. Her daily routine left little time for anything beyond work. She rose before dawn, worked until past midnight, and then slept only a few hours before the cycle began again. The grueling schedule meant she was constantly exhausted, her body never fully recovering before the next workday began. The physical toll was visible in her appearance. She was thin despite adequate food. The tavern fed its workers, with dark circles under her eyes, rough hands, and posture showing the strain of constant labour. Her personal hygiene was as good as circumstances allowed, but limited by available resources. She washed her face and hands daily using water from the tavern's supply. Full body washing occurred weekly at most, using whatever water she could spare and the minimal privacy her shared room provided. Her clothing was washed irregularly, when she had rare free time and access to water and soap. The result was that she, like everyone else, smelled of sweat, smoke, and the general human odours that were ubiquitous before modern sanitation. Her social life beyond work was minimal. The few hours between tavern closing and sleep didn't allow for much socialising. Her day off, Sunday, when the tavern was closed for at least part of the day to respect religious observance, offered limited opportunity for personal activities. She attended church, fulfilling religious obligations while also getting out of the tavern. The church attendance mixed genuine piety with social obligation and the simple desire to be somewhere else for a few hours. Her family lived in a village several days' travel away. She had left home at 14 to seek work in the city, a common trajectory for young rural women without land or marriage prospects. She hadn't seen her family in the 3 years since leaving, though she occasionally sent messages through travelling acquaintances. Her parents were small tenant farmers, struggling with their own hardships and unable to provide for all their children. Marjorie sent them money when she could spare any, though her ability to help was limited by her own poverty. The question of marriage loomed in Marjorie's thinking. At 22, she was not young by medieval standards for marriage, particularly for common women who typically married in late teens or early 20s. Her position as tavern worker made her somewhat less desirable as a marriage partner. Respectable families preferred daughters-in-law without the moral taint of tavern work. Yet she might still find a husband among men of similar low status, labourers, craftsmen, other service workers. The marriage prospects she'd encountered were unpromising. Several customers had made proposals that were clearly more about sexual access than actual marriage. A few men had shown interest that seemed more genuine, but negotiations hadn't progressed far enough to result in actual betrothal. The economic negotiations around marriage were complex. Any husband would expect Marjorie to bring something to the marriage, whether money, skills, or connections, and her resources were limited. Meanwhile, she needed to evaluate potential husband's economic prospects and characters, trying to avoid violent or improvident men who would make her life worse than her current situation. The alternative to marriage was continuing as she was, working as long as she remained physically able, and hoping to save enough for old age. Some women managed to establish themselves as brewers, or in other trades after years of saving and learning. Others became dependent on charity or died in poverty when age or illness prevented continued work. The economic insecurity of unmarried working women was severe, making marriage seem prudent even when prospects were poor. Her friendships beyond Agnes were few. She knew other servants in the neighbourhood through casual encounters, and these relationships provided some social connection. She attended church with Agnes, where they joined other young women for brief social interaction before and after services. The friendships were constrained by everyone's limited free time and the general exhaustion that characterized their lives. Deep emotional intimacy was difficult when everyone was always tired and had little private space or time for leisurely conversation. Her literacy was minimal. She could recognize some common words and signs, but couldn't read fluently, or write beyond scratching her name. Literacy wasn't expected of people in her position, and hadn't been part of her upbringing. The literate world of books and documents was largely closed to her, though she heard stories and news through oral communication at the tavern. Her mental world was shaped by oral culture, folk beliefs, religious teachings absorbed through sermons and art, and the practical knowledge needed for daily survival. Her religious life was conventional for her class and time. She believed in God, the saints, heaven and hell, and the basic Christian narrative. She prayed regularly, asking for protection from harm, for her family's well-being, and for eventual salvation. She attended Mass and observed holy days. Her faith was sincere but also practical. Religion offered comfort, explanations for suffering, hope for better afterlife, and the social benefits of participation in community religious life. Whether she believed all doctrines fully or simply conformed to expectations was a question she probably never considered in those terms. Her personal possessions beyond the essentials were few but meaningful. A small wooden carving of the Virgin Mary, given by her mother when she left home, sat on a small shelf Agnes had built. This object connected her to family and provided focus for private prayer. A ribbon, a gift from one of the kinder customers, was too nice to wear while working but was treasured as a small luxury. A brass pin holding her head covering in place was her only piece of jewellery, valued for being slightly decorative rather than purely functional. Her health was generally robust. She'd survived childhood diseases that killed many, and had constitution strong enough for the physical demands of her work. Yet she suffered from chronic ailments, frequent headaches, back pain from constant standing and carrying heavy loads, rough hands prone to cuts and infections, and occasional digestive problems from inadequate diet and poor hygiene. She had no access to medical care beyond folk remedies and prayers, so minor ailments either healed on their own or became chronic problems she simply endured. Her personal aspirations were modest by necessity. She hoped to survive, to perhaps marry someone decent, to avoid the worst fates that could befall women in her position: pregnancy outside marriage, serious illness, violent assault, complete destitution. Her dreams weren't of wealth or status, but of security, modest comfort, and perhaps eventual motherhood in a stable household. These limited aspirations reflected realistic assessments of what was possible for women in her circumstances, rather than lack of imagination about better lives. Her moments of genuine pleasure were rare but valuable. A kind word from a decent customer, a moment of laughter with Agnes, successfully navigating a difficult situation, the satisfaction of a day's work completed, the sensory pleasure of warmth after being cold or food after being hungry. These small satisfactions accumulated into something approaching contentment, despite the overall difficulty of her life. The capacity to find pleasure in small things was survival skill as much as emotional resilience. Her understanding of the broader world was limited but not non-existent. She knew that nobles and clergy lived vastly better lives than she did, though the details of their lives were as remote as if they'd lived in other countries. She knew that the King's Wars affected everyone through taxes and economic disruptions. She understood that plague could return at any time and kill millions as it had in previous generations. She lived with awareness of her vulnerability and precariousness, knowing that forces beyond her control could destroy her life at any moment. Understanding Marjorie's personal life reveals that medieval working people weren't simply their labour. They were complete humans with hopes, fears, relationships, beliefs, and inner lives that existed alongside and sometimes in tension with the grinding demands of survival. The constrained nature of her personal life, the minimal free time, inadequate living space, limited resources, few opportunities for development or advancement, shows the poverty and hardship that characterized most medieval lives. Yet her resilience, her capacity to find meaning and connection despite these constraints, demonstrates human adaptability and strength that transcends historical particulars. As dawn approaches again, and Marjorie begins to stir from too brief sleep, the cycle prepares to repeat. The day just described was neither unusually good nor particularly bad. It represented the typical experience of tavern work, the daily reality of women and men who made their living serving food and drink to the public in medieval cities. Understanding this single day illuminates broader truths about medieval life, work, and the human experience of labour before modern protections and regulations. The physical demands of tavern work were enormous and relentless. The 16 to 18-hour days, the constant standing and walking, the heavy lifting, the inadequate rest, all created cumulative physical damage that aged workers prematurely and left them chronically exhausted. Modern people working in service industries often complain about being on their feet all day. But for medieval tavern workers, there was literally no other option. The body was the primary tool of labour, and its deterioration was an inevitable consequence of years of such work. The economic exploitation was systematic and largely accepted as natural. John paid minimal wages, provided barely adequate room and board, and extracted maximum labour from workers who had few alternatives. The arrangement wasn't considered unjust by medieval standards. It was simply how labour worked in a world without minimum wages, maximum hour restrictions, or workplace safety regulations. Marjorie understood she was being exploited, but had no framework for articulating it as injustice beyond personal complaints about a hard life. The social stigma of tavern work was real and consequential. Tavern workers were suspected of immorality, seen as potentially disreputable, and sometimes explicitly excluded from more respectable social circles. The association of taverns with drink, gambling, prostitution, and general vice tainted everyone connected with them, despite many tavern workers being conventionally moral in their personal lives. Marjorie's marriage prospects were limited partly because respectable families viewed tavern work as a marker of low character, rather than merely low status. The gender dimensions of tavern work created particular vulnerabilities for women. The constant sexual harassment, the physical danger from drunk, aggressive men, the assumptions about sexual availability that accompanied female service work, all these made tavern work especially difficult and demeaning for women. Yet women worked in taverns because they needed income, and because tavern work was one of few options available to young single women without specialised skills. The gender vulnerability was understood and accepted rather than being recognised as unjust. The social importance of taverns meant that despite their negative reputations, they were essential institutions. They provided necessary services, food and drink for those without domestic facilities, lodging for travellers, social space for people lacking privacy at home, informal business venues, entertainment, and the general functions of public gathering places. The workers who made these services possible were simultaneously essential and despised, valued for their labour while being stigmatised for providing it. The human resilience demonstrated by workers like Marjorie deserves recognition. She endured daily indignities, constant exhaustion, economic exploitation, and social stigma while maintaining basic human decency, finding moments of satisfaction and connection, and surviving with her humanity more or less intact. The capacity to endure difficult circumstances while maintaining some sense of self and finding occasional pleasure is remarkable human quality visible throughout history among people in difficult circumstances. The historical continuities between medieval service work and modern equivalents are striking. The servers, bartenders, and hospitality workers of today experience many of the same dynamics: the physical demands, the harassment from customers, particularly sexual harassment of female workers, the low pay, the social status ambiguities. While modern regulations and social attitudes have improved conditions significantly, the fundamental structure of service work, providing personal service to the public for low compensation, creates similar challenges across centuries. The class dimensions of tavern work exemplify broader medieval social structures. The aristocracy didn't do service work, the middling classes sought to avoid it, and the poor performed it because they had no alternatives. The tavern was microcosm of medieval society, with clear hierarchies, complex social relationships, and constant negotiation of status and power. The owner exploited the workers served the customers, and everyone understood their positions in the hierarchy even as they sometimes resented them. The daily cycle of tavern operations, the preparation, the service, the cleaning, represented social reproduction in miniature. The tavern had to be constantly rebuilt, cleaned, restocked, and prepared for the next day's business. The labour required to maintain this cycle was substantial, and largely invisible to customers who arrived to find everything ready for them. The workers who performed this invisible labour made possible the tavern's visible functions, creating value that primarily benefited the owner, while providing them with barely adequate compensation. The urban setting of the tavern was important context. Medieval cities were crowded, dangerous, vibrant places where diverse people mixed in ways that wouldn't have occurred in more isolated rural settings. The tavern was a particularly urban institution, thriving on density and diversity, providing services the city required while reflecting urban social dynamics. Marjorie's urban experience differed profoundly from what her life would have been if she'd remained in her rural village. Whether it was better or worse is a complex question with no simple answer. The comparative perspective with other medieval occupations reveals that tavern work had distinctive characteristics. It combined service work's demands with public house's dangers and moral ambiguities. It was neither the hardest physical labour, farm work was more physically demanding, nor the lower status work. Prostitution and other shameful trades ranked lower, but occupied a complex position offering more variety and social interaction than some jobs, while creating vulnerabilities other occupations didn't face. The life trajectory for someone like Marjorie had limited possibilities. If she remained unmarried, she might continue tavern work until age or illness forced retirement, at which point she'd face poverty unless she'd managed to save money, unlikely, or had family to support her, unreliable. If she married, her life would likely involve different but equally demanding domestic labour, childbearing, with its enormous risks, and economic partnership with her husband in whatever trade or labour he pursued. Neither path promised comfort or security, but both offered the basic human satisfactions of work, relationships, and whatever meaning could be found in difficult circumstances. The mortality context provides sobering backdrop to any discussion of medieval lives. Marjorie lived with constant awareness that she could die at any time from disease, accident, violence, or medical conditions that modern medicine treats easily. The average life expectancy was perhaps 35 to 40 years, meaning that at 22 she was approaching middle age. The physical demands of her work might shorten her life further. Death was familiar presence in ways modern people in developed countries rarely experience. The ultimate lesson from examining a day in Marjorie's life is recognition that history was lived by individual humans, whose experiences mattered to them as much as anyone's experience matters to them. The tendency to view historical people statistically or abstractly, the lower classes, medieval workers, obscures their humanity. Marjorie was a real person, though this specific Marjorie is a fictional composite of historical evidence, with thoughts, feelings, hopes, and fears. Her life mattered. The hardships she endured were real suffering, not merely historical data. Understanding tavern work also reveals that many aspects of medieval life that seem romantic or colourful from historical distance were actually difficult and unpleasant for people who lived them. The quaint medieval tavern was actually crowded, smelly, poorly lit, and potentially dangerous. The colourful customers were often drunk, aggressive, and disrespectful. The simple life involved endless hard labour with minimal reward. The romantic medieval imagery obscures the reality of poverty, exploitation, and hardship that characterised most people's lives. Yet there was genuine community, pleasure, and meaning in medieval tavern life alongside the hardship. The social connections among workers, the relationships with decent customers, the satisfaction of work done well, the occasional moments of joy and laughter, these were real too. The medieval world wasn't merely brutal and horrible, even for the poor. Human capacity to find meaning and create community exists across all times and circumstances, making even difficult lives worth living from the perspectives of those who lived them. As Marjorie rises to begin another day identical to the one just described, and as countless other tavern workers throughout medieval cities wake to their own similar days, the continuity and repetition of their lives provides final reminder. History isn't just the dramatic events and famous people, but also the daily labour of ordinary people whose accumulated efforts created the societies and cultures we study. The tavern workers weren't making history in the traditional sense, but they were living it, and their lives deserve recognition and understanding as much as those of kings and bishops whose names fill the chronicles. The day in the life of a medieval tavern worker reveals human experience in all its complexity. The hardship and exploitation, yes, but also the resilience, the community, the small pleasures, and the fundamental humanity that connects people across centuries. Understanding these lives enriches our understanding of history, while reminding us that the people of the past were as fully human as we are, deserving of respect and remembrance even when their names are lost and their individual stories survive only in composite reconstructions like this one.